Hi, this is Patricia Lauria from the Global CCS Institute. I'm a senior client engagement lead in our office out of Washington, D.C. I'm currently working from home here in Oakton, Virginia. It's snowing outside. You see my Christmas decorations. So, I like to term this the holiday edition of the developing CCUS projects, but we certainly have a lot to talk about in Colorado and Wyoming. For those of you who attended the sessions yesterday, I had some great speakers and we'll continue on through that today. Again, want to thank our partners in this endeavor, the U.S. Department of Energy, the Office of Fossil Energy, and the United States Energy Association. Both have been critically important in the advancement and deployment of CCS in the United States and really around the world. We applaud kind of both their efforts, and we think that they're certainly part of why the United States continues to be the global leader on deployment of CCUS projects. And hopefully you saw that in our session yesterday where we talked about the global status of CCS report. You can go to the next slide. So day two, we have a busy day today as well. We are going to start, I'm going to give some thoughts on ESG ratings and are they driving CCS adoption based on a report recently released from the Institute from Ian Habercroft. Then we're going to do some great case studies from the region, wonderful speakers about challenges to deployment and strategies to address them. Then we're going to have a break and we're going to have breakout sessions where you can get a lot more interactive with some of our speakers from yesterday and today. You'll be able to turn on your video, turn on your mic, and have a good conversation. So we hope that you will stay tuned for that, and I'll give some instructions on that after the sessions. But if we want to go to the next slide, we'll get right into it and talk about ESG ratings. Certainly from an institute perspective, we think carbon capture and sequestration is critically important to meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and staying below 1.5 degrees. But we understand that corporations also have a financial and kind of fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So this group of work was really commissioned to see if there is interconnectivities between CCS, ESG, cost of capital, commercial performance. So we dealt with all of those questions here. This work was done on the bequest of the U.S. Department of Energy. And so while it is global in nature, you will see a lot of focus, particularly on the United States, but certainly fits within our overall strategy of looking at kind of messaging and reasons to deploy CCS. You can go to the next slide. The report itself has two pieces of work. First, Ian did a large literature review. There's a lot of research that's going on into ESG and how ESG is affecting capital reallocation, cost of capital, commercial deployment. And so we looked at that research, but then we also did interviews with three types of companies: financial institutions, ratings agencies, and corporations with large CO2 footprints to kind of add some color to that work. And the work looked to address 5 key questions. Certainly, does the company's ESG ratings impact the company? Does the CO2 footprint matter in the ESG ratings? How is CCS considered within that? And if it is, does that promote a business case for investing in CCS in so much that it maybe supports a company's ESG ratings? And finally, how does climate litigation and public support impact corporate risk and ratings? You can go to the next slide. So certainly, I think, some of the things we're seeing is the exponential growth by which I would say everything related to climate change is going on. If we look at the number of companies and cities and states and countries who are committing to net zero, we're seeing that grow exponentially. We're seeing 9 out of 10 companies last year in the S&P 500 produce sustainability reports. And we're also seeing a significant rise in the number of ESG related schemes, both voluntary and proprietary. We're also seeing this increased trend on investors kind of demanding transparency around sustainability issues. And certainly, Larry Fink's proclamations this year on behalf of BlackRock signify that, where he committed in 2021 to really focusing BlackRock's substantial investments, over $7 trillion, on companies with progressive sustainability agendas. And one of those items certainly relates to a movement to a low carbon or a zero carbon economy. In terms of the amount of money that's being kept in these sustainability funds, in 2020, I think that we're seeing over $17 trillion in sustainability funds, and that's just in the United States. That's grown 42% over from 2018. So again, I think we're definitely seeing this critical shift, and ESG ratings are certainly being used in order to help determine what are those sustainable companies. And so as such, the literature definitely tells that there is a strong link between ESG ratings and both, I would say, the cost of capital and the reallocation of capital to those companies. There's a lot of reference to many specific reports related to, I would say, kind of this notion of the linkage between ESG and these funds. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting is kind of Bank of America made a point that in 2019, they saw that corporations perceived as having a good ESG rating received significantly lower cost of capital. And we've also seen from ESG ratings companies that we did in the external interview, they suggested that ESG focused funds have demonstrated lower volatility and higher quality during these instances, during the downturns that we've seen. Now, that link between ESG performance and, I would say, commercial performance is less clear in the literature. I think there's kind of more conflicted opinions. And so it's almost like a chicken and egg. It's an organization's better commercial performance affecting the ESG performance, or vice versa. But the link between ESG and allocation of capital is certainly more clear. In the United States, that really remains voluntary whether or not companies report, although we're seeing, as I said, really increased voluntary support for that. But outside the United States, being led by Australia and Europe, we're seeing more mandatory forms of reporting, with governments, regulators, stock exchanges, all introducing those new requirements. And certainly for then global corporations, that becomes the lowest common denominator. If they need to do that reporting for Europe, they'll probably have that same reporting here in the United States. So I would say we're seeing a pretty definitive shift towards this reporting and it becoming more mandatory. We think all this just signifies what we say, moving beyond the traditional shareholder primacy model. And Ian uses the term in the report of the modern corporation, who looks increasingly across a broader set of stakeholders and asserts their commitment to protecting both the earth and the people who live on it. And we're seeing that kind of increasingly in kind of literature and performance. You can go to the next slide. So, the ESG factors are, environmental, social, and governance. So how important is climate, or GHG, to the E? And our research said it's kind of really front and foremost. Climate is almost becoming synonymous with E in that ratings. And certainly the materiality of an organization's GHG emissions are increasingly considered, meaning companies with large scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions need to demonstrate both concrete plans to lower their emissions today and what that plans are, and also kind of commitments to do that going forward. So there are really rising expectations around more detailed disclosures related to that. And certainly the report highlights the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, as a leader in, I would say, creating more transparency, more information on what should be being disclosed, and hopefully helping companies coalesce around having more standardized deployment. But right now, I would say there are multiple different types of commercial rating assessments. And so that certainly can be a challenge for corporations who may see some disparities between the different ratings depending on how they do and how do they communicate that to all their stakeholders. Go to the next slide. So how does CCS kind of play in this? And that's certainly, one of the important things that we looked at. Certainly a CCS should play a positive role in an ESG assessment as it directly reduces emissions and is a low carbon investment. The fact is, though, we didn't see a whole lot in terms of CCS affecting ESG ratings directly. In so much, I would say that not a lot of technologies affected it directly, and certainly CCS, which does have still an emerging kind of low deployment rate, didn't make that cut in terms of really being a part of that ESG ratings. Now, certainly it could contribute to an organization's ratings in so much that GHG emissions do. And so corporations that can show a lower emissions both today and for their plans for the future in that lower carbon economy, it will be reflected in that point particularly, but not that clear correlation yet between CCS and ESG assessments. Go to the next slide. So then, one of our premises was, is there a business case for investing in CCS because it will improve your ESG ratings and lower your cost of capital potentially? And we can't really make that clear connection. Although, as I said, there's certainly this connection between GHG and ESG ratings. And so hopefully that connection will be more clear over time, but still not something we kind of see, greatly reflected. We do hope that more widespread deployment of the technology may encourage greater review and have it be more kind of integrated into that conversation on ESG. Go on to the next slide. As I said, we also looked at the impact of climate litigation, and we didn't actually see a lot of connection between climate litigation and ESG directly, although certainly we do think that there's evidence of climate litigation and financial performance or cost of capital. So companies who have seen climate litigation may see a reduction in shareholder prices, and also and that could also result from, I would say, increased mobilization of individuals who are showing that they are going to, make their purchases kind of based on sustainable companies. And so we're certainly seeing that interconnectivity there and the importance of both climate litigation and public policy. Those companies who do have high GHG emissions and aren't showing a significant plan to reduce those, there's certainly a lot of risk that public policy, a carbon price, or increased legal and regulatory measures could pose a significant cost to them in the future. And that's resulting in, I would say, negative pressure from the investment community and negative pressure on their shareholder price. Next slide. So I'm not really going to go through these conclusions. You can read them here on the screen. And again, this presentation will be available afterwards. I will just make almost the same point that I started with, is that, one of the things that we think is really important here is just the rate with which things seem to be changing. So companies who, while we're not seeing the strong connection between CCS and ESG right now, companies who aren't, cognizant of the effect of their emissions on ESG ratings today and think that it's a manageable risk. And I'm not sure that there are many who do, including our members and kind of a lot of the companies here who are doing their CCS work because they don't think it's a manageable risk. But we do know that that's kind of shifting quickly, and companies need to be ever more aggressive in their decarbonization strategies, including CCS. And that's certainly the role of this two-day event in terms of how do we speed things up in terms of helping CCS become more readily deployed. And final slide there. And this just shows a picture of the report. As I said, it's available on our website in the publications section. It was written by Ian Havercroft, a great thought leader around these issues and other policy issues. And so if you have any questions on this, certainly feel free to reach out to me and Jeff. You know, we're happy to kind of discuss it further and kind of any future work that we're kind of doing around ESG and CCS. So with that, I'm going to move to our new next session, which is the case studies. And we're going to have Derek Dreyer start. He's from Lafarge Holcim. And so if we want to bring those presentations up. And he will be followed by Bryce Freeman from MTI and Marcus Lesseman. If you've been to some of our previous events, most of the projects that we highlighted there, and Lafarge Holcim is an example of this, is those projects are moving towards commercialization. There are also projects that are really important that we kind of coin more development projects that are testing technology, helping us to move to kind of next generation CCS, and those additional projects that Bryce and Marcus will talk about more fall in that category, but all are important and all are, I would say, thanks again for the Department of Energy because they have their hands in all three of these projects, I believe. And with that, I will turn it over to Derek. And we will be taking questions on these, so please send your questions through on the Q&A. And after I will have all of our three presenters go, and then we'll ask questions to the three of them. Thanks, Derek, for joining us today.
Thank you, Patricia, and good morning to everybody. And a special thanks to Patricia and Jeff Erickson and the Global CCS Institute, and also the Department of Energy that is sponsoring these events, to give us the opportunity to give you a brief introduction to what we think is really a very exciting carbon capture project that we are working on in the state of Colorado. For those of you that's not familiar with Lafarge Holcim, we are the world's largest cement producer in the world, operate in multiple countries around the world. In the US, we have 13 integrated cement manufacturing facilities. One of these being in the state of Colorado, the Portland plant, which is situated in Florence, Colorado. If we can go to the next slide. So I thought I'd start off by just giving you an overview of why the topic of carbon capture is of importance to us and where does it fit into our business strategy. So first of all, most of you would be familiar with the fact that cement is estimated to contribute to about 7% of global CO2 emissions. We are also recognized as a hard-to-abate industry, and that stems from the fact that most of our emissions actually are known as process emissions, and it comes from the processing of limestone, calcium carbonate, and dissociating that into lime and CO2. So inherent to our cement production process is the generation of CO2. And therefore the recognition, if you look on the right-hand side of the slide there, that even though we've made great progress in terms of reducing our carbon intensity and improving our fuel efficiencies, and we continue to make great strides in our product development, there's a recognition by our company, and I think in our industry as a whole, that carbon capture is going to have to be part of the solution to fully decarbonize in the long term. So our company earlier this year was the first in our industry to commit to net zero by 2050. And we are working with the Science Based Target Initiative globally to develop that roadmap for our company to decarbonize by 2050. And again, at this stage, carbon capture is definitely going to be part of the longer term developments, and therefore us already starting to invest in it. If we can go to the next slide. So talking about the specific project that we have at the Portland plant in Florence, Colorado, we are part of a consortium of partners that's investing in the development of this project. And I think some of the speakers again yesterday emphasized the point that it's often a different skill set or a different set of expertise that's required in terms of the upstream, the actual carbon capture technology, and then the downstream services. So we've recognized that, and for that reason, we've got this partnership. Total is a valuable partner in the form of a sponsor of the project, and they've also participated in some of our other projects in North America. We're using Svante as a technology provider, and they've really played a very pivotal role in bringing together the business partner or the different partners, and then also coordinating a lot of the design that has been done to date. Ourselves, Lafarge Holcim, who of course owns and operates the facility in Colorado, and so we're the CO2 emitter. And then also Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, which many of you would be familiar with, and recognizing that they have extensive expertise as a CO2 off-taker, and potentially playing a role in EOR if that's the route that we follow. So a strong partnership and different players with different sets of expertise that's participating. As far as the capacity that we're looking at the facility, we're still going through some refinements and early stages of scoping and design, but in the vicinity of 1.5 to 2 million tons of CO2 capture is the capacity that we're looking for in the design. We can go to the next slide. So briefly, what have we done thus far? What has been the focus to date? And in 2020, it's been largely focused on doing a scoping study, bringing the different partners together and defining the project. So within the scoping study, we've done a class 4 techno-economic analysis. And so some of the outputs of that has been developing block flow diagrams, looking at the tie-ins into the plant, the actual potential layout of the plant. We've done process flow diagrams and steam tables. So a lot of preliminary pre-feasibility and scoping design that's gone into it. This has allowed us to start drafting some preliminary CapEx numbers, and then also doing some operating cost modeling or OpEx modeling. We've done this around different scenarios as it's still in the early stage development. And that's really rolled over into the second task that we completed this year, which is the project financial model and sensitivity analysis. So I've highlighted 45Q there. I know that's been a specific topic in these sessions. And also just to say that it's key for the development of this project as well. So without 45Q, there's no real economic viability. With 45Q, it becomes a possibility. Clearly, at this stage of development, we're still looking at a sensitivity around a number of variables, and those will be refined in time. So that led into then the third task that we've been working on, and that is getting a detailed plan for front-end engineering design done. And so we've also completed that plan. If we can go to the next slide. So I thought it'd be useful to at least just include a diagram or two. The top left, I know that's small, but it's just the indication of kind of the footprint that we've been looking at. Again, there's different scenarios, but it is a sizable installation, as you may know from the capacity that I mentioned earlier. And then the diagram on the right-hand side, that is the rotary adsorbent machines from Svante that's going to be employed in this project. I think it's important to talk a little bit about why Colorado and why this plant. I think the one thing to mention is that Colorado, the state, we found the state very supportive to date. They've been vocal in supporting the project. We had a letter of support from Senator Bennett in our funding application to the DOE. And we also see the state as being progressive in terms of technology advancement and sustainability and the environmental regulatory framework. So we really do think Colorado is a good state for us to pursue this. I also want to, really just again emphasize that our next phase, which is the pre-feasibility and feasibility phases, we were a successful applicant in the DOE NETL funding announcement that was done earlier this year. And so very appreciative of that. And you know, without it, again, it would be very difficult to make these great advancements and development that we've done today. Next slide, please. So what are we going to potentially do with the CO2? And again, early stages, but there's a few off-take scenarios that we're evaluating in the pre-feasibility stage. The one to note is that the well-known Sheep Mountain pipeline that carries CO2 through the state of Colorado to the Permian Basin, that runs about 60 miles south of our plant. So part of the evaluation is to see if that is a possibility and you know, tying into that pipeline. And then on the right-hand side, I just had a diagram, and that's an excerpt from the Southwest Region's Partnership for Carbon Sequestration, who's done some preliminary work indicating that there is potential sequestration sites that could be developed, you know, in close proximity to the plant. So those are the offtake options that we are evaluating. Next and final slide. So I thought it'd be useful just to talk briefly about the project development methodology and where we are in the progress thus far. So we're using a stage gate process, and really we've now completed the scoping study. That's been a success. We've gotten great participation from our partners and very optimistic about the development to date. And we've now then started with the pre-feasibility and feasibility, which is probably going to run into the early part of 2022. And again, that is being done with the support from the DOE funding. And then, as you can see, still a lot of work to complete, and we're acutely aware of the current time limits on the 45Q, which would require us to really start construction before the end of 2023. So working towards that timeline. So appreciate your time and look forward to the rest of the discussions today.
Thanks, Derek. And Bryce Freeman will be our next presenter from Membrane Technology and Research.
Thank you, Patricia, and thanks to all of you for joining this session, and thanks for the invitation to be here from GCCSI. I'm Bryce Freeman from MTR, joining you from our offices in Newark, California, out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm going to give you a little update on our activities in Wyoming. We've got 2 Department of Energy funded projects, and also tell you a little bit about our technology and our process. The next slide, please. So many of you may be familiar with membranes and how they're used for carbon capture. Some of you may not. So this is just a single slide to kind of orient you on what membranes are and what the process looks like. If you look at the upper left-hand corner, you would see kind of a cross-section of a membrane. So this is a roll-to-roll product that's manufactured. If you see, it looks a bit like an engineered paper. Really, all of the work is done in a very thin and very specialized selective layer, and those are optimized and selected for each type of separation. So much of our work here at MTR through our development timeline has been to develop the Polaris membrane, which does a very good job of separating CO2 from nitrogen. And unlike an amine process, which I'm sure most of you are much more familiar with, which uses a thermal driving force for the separation process, we depend on pressure and particular pressure gradients. So for us, we take flue gas from the source, from the power plant in this case, just before the stack. We pass it between membrane sheets and apply a vacuum on the opposing side, on the permeate side. And the properties of the membrane and the pressure gradients give us the transport, and that is in essence how membranes do their separations. The little diagram below kind of shows you a little illustration of how the gas moves through the membrane. The flow path for the gas is about 1 meter. And the mechanics of the modules are such that you've got a flue gas that goes in as a single stream. So one stream in and 2 streams out. So we have a residue that comes out and a CO2 source, which is our CO2 concentrated stream. So that's kind of, what membranes, look like and conceptually, and kind of how they're packaged. If you look to the right, this is how they're put together in a process. And you'll see some numbers 1 through 6 in red. And that shows the path of the CO2 as it goes first from the flue gas and on through the process until it's in its final state, which is a high pressure, high purity product. And the role of the membranes in this process really is to enrich the CO2 from its native state of, let's say, 13 to 15%, up to the point where we can cool it and compress it. So the membranes are used in the front end, in this case in 2 stages. We do a first pass of separation and enrichment, which gets us to about 50% CO2. And then a second stage, which gets us up to about 85%. And at that point, the gas is compressed. It's cooled to the point where the CO2 condenses. The inerts, which are mostly nitrogen and oxygen, come off the top. And the bottom product is a very high purity CO2, which is then pumped to final pressure. So as we move from source to source, whether it's a coal plant, a gas plant, a cement plant, this process with minor variations is essentially what we use. And in each case, we kind of optimize it for that. Okay, so that is the kind of the one slide primer on membranes. This now is our development timeline. The 2 products on the right, the one in the green and the one in the orange, are what I'm going to talk about today. And they really represent kind of our, I would say, kind of scale up in activities, where the prior projects and field testing to the left of those were our research and demonstration of the membrane in first use. And those were all done in Department of Energy sponsored projects on different flue gases from power plants in the National Carbon Capture Center. So as you see on the diagram here on the right, we have 2 projects. One is a 10 megawatt large pilot, and the other is a full scale engineering and design project. Both of those are going on at the same location, which is Dry Fork Station. If I could have the next slide. Great. So Dry Fork Station is a new modern coal plant in the northeast portion of Wyoming. It's about 400 megawatts. It's majority owned and operated by Basin Electric, and commissioned in 2011. So it's one of the newer coal-fired power plants in the U.S. As you might expect, a full complement of modern controls. And so those things are all mostly normal. The part that is different or a bit unique, this is a zero liquid discharge plant. So there's no water source here used for process cooling or steam condensing. And you see maybe on the right side of the photo here, the air-cooled condenser. So that's a rather unique feature for a coal plant. And this condenser is also one of the largest in North America. So not only does the coal plant have to deal with a zero liquid discharge plant, we also have to as well in the capture process. This site's also important because it's home to the Wyoming Integrated Test Center. This is a new dedicated test center for post-combustion CO2 capture testing. And just across the property line is home to the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project, DOE's sequestration project. And that team's led by the University of Wyoming. Next slide, please. So in our first project, we're doing a 10 times scale up of our CO2 capture process, the one that I kind of showed in the earlier diagram. And this will be, say, kind of a complete implementation of our process, and it will kind of feature all of the process conditions and separation conditions that we envision at full scale. We'll be using a new low-cost plate and frame membrane module that will first be tested in Norway at the Technology Center in Mongstad, starting early next year. This will be a scale-up of that. And we'll be operating on a slipstream of flue gas that's provided to the Wyoming Integrated Test Center from Dry Fork Station. They have a dedicated area for large test systems and a dedicated area for small test systems. And the ductwork that you see there is the line servicing the large test center we'll be placing our plant. So this large capture project is a DOE project. It's multi-phase. The first phase was to secure the host site and the team. That work is done. We're now in phase 2, which is to complete all of the engineering, the design, select a constructor, go through a construction plan, acquire permitting, acquire permits for the project, and construction plan, and to secure all the funding that's needed for the cost sharing for phase 3. The phase 2 is a competitive down select to phase 3. Those decisions will be made by DOE at the first part of next year. And for us in phase 3, it is really provides the funding to build, construct, and operate this 10 megawatt plant. So that's where we are in the status of the large pilot CO2 capture project. If I could have the next slide. And concurrent to that, we have a full-scale front-end engineering design of the same process now at full scale. So this would be a 40 times scale-up of the large pilot. We'll be processing all of the flue gas from Dry Fork Station. We're nominally targeting a 70%, 75% capture rate. And that is important for a few reasons. One, it exceeds the carbon safe threshold of 50 million tons captured in a 30-year period, which this project is coordinated with the Wyoming Carbon Safe project team, as I mentioned, just over the property line. And this project, Dry Fork Station, is the identified CO2 source for that project. So we're right in the middle of this work. It's a 2-year effort. We'll be finishing towards the end of next year. And for both the large pilot and this project, I'd say Wyoming has been a great state, not only with cooperation of Basin, but also with the Department of Environmental Quality, through the governor's office, through the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, partnership with the Carbon Safe team. It's a very much a can-do site. And there's many good opportunities here, not just with the sequestration well in the backyard, but also the Green Corps pipeline, which is some 6 miles away. And in the immediate area, there's quite a few CO2 injection activities ongoing. So we're very happy to have these awards from DOE. We thank them for it. We're looking forward to phase 3 large pilot project. And yeah, just encourage also the folks who are considering Wyoming. It's a very good place to do capture. And that, Patricia, is my last slide.
Great, thank you very much. And Marcus, if you want to come on, turn on your video, we'll move on to your slides. And Marcus is from U.S Technology Institute, and so excited to kind of hear about the work you're doing in Wyoming and your collaboration with the Integrated Test Center.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the Global CCS Institute and the Department of Energy and USEA making this event possible. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'll be talking about a brand new project that is about to get kicked off for engineering scale testing of the next generation carbon capture technology. Let me first thank our project partners, specifically Ohio State University as the developer of the core technology, but then also the Wyoming Integrated Test Center as the test host site. Before I go into the project, I want to give you just a very brief intro to GTI, so maybe you can go to the next slide. GTI is an independent not-for-profit organization originally established by the natural gas industry. We've been working on energy challenges for more than 75 years, really turning new technology approaches into practical solutions. The organization works across the entire energy supply chain, really starting from energy supply, downhole work, all the way to conversion, separation technologies, delivery, and then all the way to the utilization to the burner tip, really. So technology development to reduce carbon emissions while simultaneously enabling economic growth, that is really at the core of what we do. And as part of that, GTI has a portfolio of technology approaches for carbon capture. We work closely with the Department of Energy on a variety of projects, ranging from early stage, lab scale, bench scale, technology development, all the way through large scale demonstrations. So today I'm going to present on an engineering scale project for transformational membrane technology that's coming out of Ohio State. Next slide, please. So the project has been selected by DOE for a $13 million award, complemented by $3.25 million cost sharing through the project partners. We are in the very final stages of contract negotiations there, so kickoff is anticipated really, next month for the project. The objectives are to design and build engineering scale CO2 capture systems. So that's going to be 1 megawatt equivalent of flue gas using Ohio State's new transformational membrane technology. We will be conducting tests on coal flue gas, parametric studies, but then also long-term studies going forward. Performance targets, we want to achieve CO2 capture with 95% CO2 purity at a cost of $30 a ton, and cost of electricity that's at least 30% less than the baseline CO2 capture technology amine based. And all of that with a path to be commercial by 2030. You see here the team members. GTI is the prime contractor to DOE, will be leading the skid design, skid installation, and the field testing. Ohio State University as co-PIs on this DOE award, they will be leading the commercial sized membrane and module fabrication, and then all the testing related to that, and also will participate in the design inspection of the field equipment and ultimately participate also in the field test. ITC is the host site, will be leading the site preparation, of course, and support all the engineering design installation of the skid and ultimately the field testing. Trimeric Corporation will be the lead on TEA and EH&S assessment. Go to the next slide, please. So ITC is really a critical partner for this project. Jason Beggar talked about it yesterday, so we are really excited that ITC is allowing us to test this technology at their facility at the Dry Fork Power Station with actual flue gas. You see some of the features here of ITC. While they are really focused on larger scale testing, the facility also has test bays for smaller tests. So the 1 megawatt scale that I'm talking about will be tested at those smaller test bays. But really the availability of the flue gas and this overall test infrastructure and the knowledgeable staff that comes with that, that's really a great asset for our project. Next slide, please. So who's invested in the Wyoming Technology Center? It's to a large extent, it's really the state of Wyoming with $15 million. Then Basin Electric, Tri-State, also with substantial investment and other partners there as well. So why is this important? The substantial investment by the state of Wyoming is really critical because it enables us to leverage the federal funding from the DOE. As you know, federal funding comes with a cost share requirement. And for a not-for-profit organization like GTI, that really matters. As you'll see, this technology is still a few years away from being fully commercial. So without this partnership, GTI would not be in a position to advance this early stage technology that far. Next slide, please. So what's so exciting about this transformational membrane technology developed by Ohio State? It's really step out performance. And you see that on the plot on the right side. Think of the selectivity on the y-axis as an efficiency, essentially how well the membrane can separate CO2 from the flue gas. And the permeance on the x-axis is really a measure of how easily the CO2 moves through the membrane. So a higher permanence or a higher flux means that you need less membrane area, and that means a smaller and less capital intensive CO2 capture process. And you can see that the Ohio State membranes really have far superior performance compared to the state of the art as is indicated through the Robeson upper bound curve there. The superior performance is really achieved through a facilitated transport mechanism through the membrane. So there's a carrier molecule that essentially assists the transport of CO2 through the membrane. And OSU has shown that these novel membrane materials can be put into spiral wound modules very similar to conventional gas separation modules that then can be scaled up and produced on a large scale. Next slide, please. So when you look at the economic potential, that is really a result of this, of the potential of this membrane. So we did initial economic assessment, and those assessments have shown that the capture cost can be around $30 per ton of CO2 with this type of membrane performance. And you see that the curve capture cost as a function of CO2 recovery, that is very typical for membrane systems. So membrane systems are good for, let's say, bulk CO2 removal, around 60 to 80% capture rates. Higher CO2 capture rates, like 90%, are possible, but they do require a somewhat more complex process with higher capex and also with a higher energy penalty. So it really becomes an economic trade-off between producing the lowest cost CO2 or capturing as much CO2 as possible at a somewhat higher cost. So that really depends on what the economics are in the specific region for application. Next slide, please. So the team at OSU has done already extensive testing with these membranes at bench scale and has shown that the membrane performance is really extremely robust. On the left, you see 2,500 hours of lab scale testing with a generation 2 membrane, very high flux with simulated flue gas. And you see that's extremely stable performance. Generation 1 membrane were tested. The performance not quite as high in terms of flux, but essentially same chemistry, if you will. And those membranes were tested at the National Carbon Capture Center with actual flue gas and also no performance degradation over hundreds of hours. So we believe that this technology is really ready for further scale up and testing. The next slide, please. So in the project, we'll be engineering a 1 megawatt equivalent capture system that will be installed at the Wyoming Integrated Test Center. You see the aerial view here at the 1 megawatt size that we'll be operating at, or about 20 tons per day of CO2. We will be needing 3 of the smaller test bays at ITC. You see that indicated by the yellow box there, right in the center of the picture. And on the right, you see actually the flue gas coming to that test facility. The team will perform extensive parametric studies and then also long-term testing of the membrane modules for at least 2 months. Next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. So finally, this last slide shows the technology maturation part. Substantial effort has gone into the development of the membranes as well as the modules and bench scale testing over the last few years, supported by the Department of Energy and got the technology to a technology readiness level of 5. So with the current project, we will advance the technology to the 1 megawatt scale and achieve TRL6. That means that we will be generating the necessary data for pre-commercial capture system demonstration in the future. So this project, as I mentioned, is about to get kicked off. It will be running through 2024. And from there on, we do expect another large scale demonstration, 10 megawatts or larger, which could possibly also take place at the Wyoming Test Center. So with that, let me thank again the team, including the partners from Ohio State, Wyoming Test Center, as well as the Department of Energy for their continued support. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Marcus. And so I'll like to invite all the panelists to come back on, turn back on their video. And we have gotten a lot of questions that have come through. So thank you to our audience for their participation. I'm going to start with you, Derek. There were several questions as to how you went about kind of choosing the technology for the project. And, you know, did you evaluate other technologies, cryomembrane? And again, how did you come to this conclusion, choose this technology?
Good question, Patricia. And for us as a company, yes, we've evaluated a number of different technologies. And obviously in this space, there's a tremendous amount of development that's still ongoing, as we see from these webinars and from the presentations that we often participate in with the DOE. There's a lot of development in the space. And understanding that there's also technologies like amine technology that's been around maybe for a longer time. In terms of our projections and understanding right now around capital cost requirements and also operating cost modeling and what we think has the most potential right now with the visibility that we have is the membrane and adsorbent materials. And understand that there's still a lot of technology maturation that needs to happen, but we're all trying to accelerate it. So we've basically selected the technology on that basis. We think it's one of the ones that has certainly the best potential, and you know, therefore working with it.
Great, and I'll do kind of a follow up. Can you share what's the estimated percentage of CO2 captured in the Svante adsorber, and where are the steam and power supplied from? Yep.
So right now, capture rate is estimated above 90%. That is what we're working towards. As far as the utility requirement, obviously that is a significant question that needs to be answered through these pre-feed phases. At this stage, steam generation most likely would have to be done through natural gas. But in our preliminary design, we're also looking at then taking any CO2 emissions from potential steam generation and also running that through the capture unit. So there won't be any excess CO2 being generated from steam generation. And then, similarly with the other utilities, there's an evaluation ongoing in terms of potential water access and the total water demand, and also on the actual electrical energy side. So we know it takes a lot of electrical energy. A lot of the studies that you see presented is done by power plants, so they have the energy generation right there. For us as an industrial facility, we obviously procure electrical energy, so very important for us to also look at renewable electrical energy input into the facility to be able to run the carbon capture plant.
Great, thanks, Derek. I'll put this out to both Bryce and Marcus. So there were questions on how do you think your technology will compare in terms of performance? So cost, energy penalty, efficiency. There was you talked about that 70% capture rate, Bryce. How do you see that kind of comparing to other technologies? And a follow-up question was also, what time frame will these be TRL9 kind of system proven and ready for commercial deployment, do you think?
Okay, maybe I'll go first to that. So the prior work that we've done in testing has been on systems for 90% capture. And in the techno-economic studies that we've done and that DOE has done, we've been very competitive with amine-based systems. The reason why we've gone lower is to 7% capture is there's some opportunities there to reduce cost a bit more, right? So we're currently doing the TEAs for the 70 to 75% capture cost. But we believe it'll be competitive on cost. I think if anything, there are other things to factor other than just cost, although cost is extremely important. Kind of compactness, the ease and the amount of time it takes to put in a retrofit, in other words, how much time the plant's down, footprint issues, or other factors. And some of those areas membranes do quite well. So competitive on cost, and then if you factor some of the other kind of, I would say, inherent attributes of membranes, there's some merit to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I can just add to it. I mean, I really want to second that the technology that we are testing is also a membrane technology. So it has those features that and advantages that Bryce just mentioned. Ultimately, it comes down to a cost. We do believe with this approach, while we're at an earlier TRL level compared to what MTR is currently testing, we do believe that we are very competitive in terms of cost, getting down to the $30 per ton of CO2 captured. And I think the second part of the question also was the timeline towards TRL9, towards having a commercial system ready. We anticipate that to be in the 2028 timeframe. So the current project does require about 4 years of building and testing. Then there will be another large-scale testing required for our technology at the 10 megawatt or larger scale, which also would take at least 3 years to be realistic.
Great. And just I'm not quite sure you fully answered the question on kind of energy penalty. Do you have any kind of further thoughts on energy penalty with your projects in comparison to what you know about other projects?
So we usually express the energy that's used by our capture process in kilowatt hours per metric ton of CO2 captured. It's a very convenient way to measure those. And we're just under 350 kilowatt hours per metric ton for the design that will be featured in the full-scale FEED project. So that would be indicative of a first of a kind implementation or first build. And then there's opportunities to improve beyond that, but that's kind of where we're at now.
Yeah, so for our system, I don't have the specific energy requirement at the top of my head, but it's of course included in the cost estimates. Fundamentally, membrane systems operate somewhat differently from systems like amine systems or solid sorbent-based systems that require heat for regeneration. So the energy requirement really comes from the compression and recirculation elements. It's not a heat requirement in the membrane systems.
Great. I'll go back to Derek. We have a question on how do you think about CCS and how it will impact the manufacturing cost of your products? And, given that you're kind of a global producer, how does kind of thinking about whether you're doing it, but your competitors aren't doing it, how is all of this going into your corporate strategic thinking?
Yeah, that's a great question, Patricia, and a difficult one to answer for sure. And clearly, those payback calculations and the cost impacts may be different in different regions of the world or different countries, as different countries grapple with the right regulatory frameworks and penalties and incentives around CO2. So, from an industry, we see the macro trend. You've said at the outset of the session today how the focus on sustainability and ESG from an investor standpoint and even from a financing standpoint is becoming increasingly important. So we know that the requirement will be there in future. How exactly that's going to impact our product costing and how that gets translated, either to the consumer potentially, that's still uncertain and very dependent on the regulatory framework that that we operate in. But I think it's the clear recognition again that there's this macro trend. We're committed to sustainability, and therefore the need that we've got to participate and we've got to start developing these projects because it's going to be part of our future.
Great, thanks, Derek. And we have another question for you. If you could give any more detail on how that CO2 will be stored. I know you kind of expressed that there could be EOR, but that hasn't been determined. But any more thinking there?
Well, that's really the two options that we're evaluating, and ideally, at this stage of development, we want to be sure that we develop different avenues, right? We don't only kind of hang our hat on only one option, and because it's still early stage. So we know the sheet mountain pipeline runs close by the plant, so that's providing us potential access to the EOR option. And then on sequestration, there's clearly still a lot of study work that needs to be done to confirm potential sequestration sites. But at the same time, preliminary work that's been done indicates that the geological formations are suitable in certain areas, and that it's a very likely solution that could be pursued in time. There's also questions about hubs. I know that's been addressed in some sessions. Those will develop in time as other players and industries participate. We're also hopeful that those areas become other alternatives for us to look at in addition to what we know thus far.
Great, thanks. And I'll ask you one more question. The direct question is, why not inject CO2 into cement for mineralization? I'll let you answer that, but I don't know if you also, I know Lafarge Holcim actually has multiple kind of projects that they're looking at around the world, and some of them are utilization projects. So if you can kind of maybe speak to how you're thinking about storage versus utilization.
Yeah. Also a good question. And I think if you look back at the presentation I did there, included in the roadmap is not only carbon capture. There's a few other elements. Included is product innovation. And so that would fall within product innovation. But the fact also still remains that on a global basis, we've got a large amount of CO2 to deal with. And product innovation will play a part, but it's also not the only solution. So we do look at mineralization and use projects. We also know that the DOE is actively funding some of those research projects and some of these testing facilities. Carbon capture or use or utilization in cementitious products are being researched. So we're also keenly following those as they develop.
Great, thank you. Bryce, a question for you, and not sure if you can answer, but we can certainly discuss it. Kara Fornstrom's going to talk a lot about some of Wyoming's kind of plans for power utilities and what kind of the requirements are from legislative perspective. But the question was, what percentage of CO2 capture is required at Dry Fork Station to achieve the planned 2030 Wyoming CO2 emissions limit? So just kind of maybe talk about how that project is working within some of the regulatory items that Wyoming's looking at.
That one I should know right off the top of my head. I don't. I know the regulation, but the limits I'm blanking on right now. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Again, I'm sure Kara can kind of help with that in the next session as well. Another question we have here, I think for you, and Marcus can also answer kind of in terms of membranes, is how are membranes with respect to degradation and fouling, especially if they're functionalized in some ways? And because I'd say membrane fouling is a challenge with most industrial applications.
You want me to go first, Marcus?
Well, I mean, I can, of course, the membranes that we're going to be testing, there are at a earlier stage of development, if you will. Nevertheless, I did show you data where we've tested those membranes with typical flue gas constituents like oxygen, like sulfur, SO2 in there for thousands of hours, 2,500 hours, without any significant performance degradation. Those membranes were also tested then with actual flue gas at the National Carbon Capture Center over hundreds of hours. So they're very robust. I mean, in terms of chemical degradation, they're, we can assume they're really robust. And also what you see, I mean, these membrane systems are modular systems. So you will not have a whole process fail. So on a commercial application, you would have hundreds and thousands of these modules ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. For us, we've also done testing on a cold dry flue gas before with particulates and all the other components and things, up to 11,000 hours in total. And then the Polaris membrane does have a few commercial instances for MTR. We have another kind of commercial business where we sell membrane systems for industrial separations, and those are accumulating hours. Membranes are a passive system. There's no kind of real reactions going on within them. So the materials themselves are robust. The thing you really don't want is to foul them with a big plug of ash, right? Maybe that's the most concerning outcome. So for that, it's good controls in the system to make sure you're not running if that's occurring in the flue gas, and be able to divert and isolate. But other than that, this is a good application for membranes in terms of compatibility of flue gas with the membrane materials.
Great, and on that, we actually are at time. I appreciate you all very much, Marcus, Derek, and Bryce, for being so kind of transparent about the work that you're doing, being open to these questions, and really being proponents for CCS. We really appreciate your participation in this event, and we look forward to kind of events in the future and seeing your projects move forward. I will kind of highlight, if you're one of the people who asked a lot of questions about kind of different technologies and how they might apply to different types of emitters, in our breakout sessions, we're going to have Emily Kunkel from Sargent & Lundy. And certainly one of the things that they do, if an emitter is looking at CCS and hasn't decided on a technology is help them make some of those technology determinations. And so she'll be presenting a couple slides as well as answering questions on that. So if that's something you're interested in, that could certainly be a good breakout session for you. I'd like to invite our next group of panelists to come up at this time, and we'll talk about kind of challenges to deployment and strategies for addressing them. And so I'd like to invite Kara Fornstrom. She's the chairman of the Wyoming Public Service Commission, has a long history with CCS in Wyoming and supporting utilities via her work with NARUC. Lee Beck from Clean Air Task Force. Many of you know Lee Beck was kind of recently with the Institute, went on and is kind of doing great work with an environmental NGO on supporting policy for CCUS. And I hear some congratulations are in order for some work that she's done, but I'll let her kind of talk about that. And then we'll have Will Scheimer. He's a business development manager for projects from OGCI Climate Investments. And many of you know Will. He's been on the technology side previous to this. And so also is kind of a great resource on different technologies. So Will, if you want to turn on your kind of video and mic as well. So again, with this session, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to start with some questions, but we'll pass it over and kind of look at the questions in our Q&A box about kind of halfway through the session. I'm going to start with a question for Lee. You know, Clean Air Task Force is the first environmental NGO that we've had in this kind of series of 2 days. So wanted to let you first kind of give some perspectives from that environmental NGO on CCS and its importance to climate change mitigation, but also, you know, how we ensure that these projects meet their mitigation objectives without kind of causing any other environmental harm.
Yes, thank you, Patricia. And thank you so much to the Global CCS Institute for inviting me to join this discussion today. It's an honor to be on this panel with many people I've been working closely with. And for those of you who don't know the Clean Air Task Force, we're an environmental organization, US based, but currently expanding internationally. And we're really focused on advanced energy technologies. The International Energy Agency has recently shown that 75% of emissions reductions on the road to net zero are expected to come from technologies not yet mature. So we're really focused on that chunk on hydrogen, carbon capture, nuclear, geothermal. And so we're really focused on creating policy and technology pathways for this innovation to happen. And of course, carbon capture is one of our top priorities because we think it is working. It's been shown to work at scale, and now we need to really create a policy pathway for scaling it up. But I think we're going to talk about policy in a little bit. What I think is, from your perspective, really, or from our perspective, really important is that there has been this realization over the past 2 years, thanks to the IPCC landmark report, of course, that carbon capture is needed to achieve global climate goals. But that realization is, of course, not enough to make it a reality. So, and as I said earlier, we need to talk about policy, but we also really need to create and build a supportive, diverse political economic ecosystem that will support the scale up of carbon capture. And the pathway towards doing so is we need to work on creating trust. We need to show that it is safe and working. This was something that was highlighted over and over by the energy minister announcing the Northern Lights project yesterday, or the parliamentary decision on the Northern Lights project yesterday. Well, we need to show that it's working so we can create these projects, and we need to have these projects be completely transparent and completely open to scrutiny. And I mean, I have to acknowledge that there is a lot of mistrust. When I look in the media, it's often, especially by organization, berated out accountability. And so I think if we're looking back at, for example, what happened this spring, when Senator Menendez's report showed that only 3 of 10 taxpayers claiming 45Q were actually adhering to MRV requirements. Of course, this investigation showed that the system was working, but it also showed that there is, if we really want to be successful in creating a pathway for carbon capture, we need to make sure that we're creating transparent pathways of storage through MRV plants, and we need to make sure that that everything is completely transparent and visible. And I think that because there's so much criticism already, we're always sharing this risk that if we're not doing it right, we might no longer be able to scale up carbon capture, which of course would be detrimental to achieving our climate goals. So I'll stop here, Patricia. I hope this answered your question, and I'm so very much looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely, and I'll ask one more follow-up question. Do you think that, I would say both the EPA from a broader perspective and Wyoming, do they have the skill sets and I would say the manpower they need to support kind of well permits and MRV plan monitoring that we're going to need to kind of have in order to kind of scale up CCS?
Yeah, I mean, the permitting, of course, is a big bottleneck. I think it was said in a recent congressional hearing, or it's actually not that recent, but this year it was said there's half a person working at EPA to permit Class 6 wells, and of course permits. And of course, this is a potential massive bottleneck. We've seen more than 30 projects announced as a result of 45Q. So we're of course looking for more funding at the EPA, but also more funding for states to follow the pathway of Wyoming and being able to get Class 6 well primacy. So I think this is an important aspect that is an easy policy fix from my perspective.
Great. All right, I'd like Kara to join the conversation. And, we've been talking about the variety of opportunities to use CCS in kind of decarbonization. Derek gave some great examples from the cement industry, but certainly Wyoming has taken a very proactive approach regarding looking at CCS on power and done some innovative policy with both SF 159 and HB 200 for promoting CCS on power facilities. Do you want to kind of walk through some of Wyoming's pathway there, and why is this important to Wyoming, and how's kind of these implementations of some of these bills going?
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. I think I'll just briefly hit on Senate File 159 and House Bill 200. I know we'll go into a little bit more depth in a minute, but Senate File 159 was passed by the legislature in 2019. It was amended in 2020 by Senate File 21. The concept behind Senate File 159 is it requires utilities to make a good faith effort to sell any retiring coal unit. So this does not just apply to those units that are retiring early or may retire early. It applies to all units, even if they reach the end of their established depreciable life. And while those coal units could be used for a variety of issues, I will say that the interest that we've had in terms of just contacting the commission and other agencies in Wyoming in purchasing those coal units really has come from carbon capture projects. So we have the commission has just finished its 18-month, 19-month rulemaking process to implement Senate File 159. Those rules are pending for signature with Governor Gordon. We've set out an extensive process for the application of that. Those applications are required 24 months prior to any retirement of any coal unit. And then there are 3 processes that go with that. 1, retention of an independent evaluator to help facilitate the sale, the bidding, all of that. 2nd is the actual coal unit solicitation. What information needs to be contained in that application so that prospective purchasers have the information they need to make a financial decision. And then 3rd, the commission's avoided cost determination. So Senate File 159 contains almost a PURPA-like must-take requirement from the potential purchaser to the utility at the avoided cost set by the commission. Commission is very used to setting avoided costs. The statute, however, adds another component of reliability. So we've had to set out how the commission will set avoided cost as part of the Senate File 159 process. Then depending on whether that process is successful or unsuccessful, the utility has to come to the commission under Chapter 3, Section 21G, either way to show if it is a successful sale, the commission has some obligation to make sure that's in the public interest, because we would lose jurisdiction over that prospective purchaser. There are some decommissioning requirements, potentially some bonding requirements that we don't typically require of utilities. And if it is unsuccessful, the statute requires the commission to make a good faith determination that the utility made a good faith determination. If we determine that they have not, they will be unable to, they will be ineligible for cost recovery of any replacement generation resource of that coal unit. So that's what I really call the hammer of Senate File 159 is future cost recovery. So we can talk about that in more detail in a minute. House Bill 200 is really Governor Gordon's visionary approach to clean energy policy. It was passed by the legislature in 2020. It, I think, takes into account and recognizes the difficulty of retaining reliability of electricity services with different forms that are now coming on the grid. So it enables us to retain our reliability standards provided by the coal fleet while looking at adding a clean energy component to that. It's different than other state mandates on clean energy in that it does not set a specific portfolio standard. Instead, it defers to the expertise of the commission in a one-on-one application by each utility. Each utility will likely have a different portfolio standard based on the realistic assessment of their coal fleet and where a retrofit for carbon capture is appropriate. The more significant part, I think, of House Bill 200 is it expands our innovative rate making authority in several ways. First, it specifically allows us to put carbon capture into rate base, which I think a specific policy nod on that, given the lack of commercial viability at this point, is important. But it does not take away our typical prudency review. We are, at the end of the day, economic regulators, and the commission would have to make a decision about whether that made sense to put into rate base or not. But importantly, it offers some other business models than the traditional rate making model for utilities to invest. For example, any portion that the utility may put into rate base, they are eligible for a higher ROE as authorized by the commission. And that is an important incentive, as we know, in the existing business model for utilities. It also allows specifically for perhaps a sharing band between shareholders and customers on the sales revenue generated from CO2 sales. I think most people would say CO2 is a commodity that's owned by the ratepayers. But this statute says to incentivize utilities will allow them to take a portion as determined by the commission of those CO2 sales and go directly to shareholders. Importantly, that source of revenue would not be considered when they do their annual reports on annual return. So they aren't in the risk of over-earning pursuant to their authorized return from their last rate case. That is a separate source of income that is sort of, we'll track it for sure, but it would be sort of off the books in terms of those calculations. It also allows for a rate rider to be instituted prior to the CCUS project. So utility could apply for that at any time and start collecting up to 2% of total bills of customers in Wyoming, put that in a fund to finance part of the CCUS project as we go forward. So it contains important ratepayer protections, but it also says if that 2% turns out to be insufficient, but the utility can show that they prudently incurred any additional expenses, it allows for us to allow those additional expenses. So it has ratepayer protections, it has utility protections from an investment perspective, and I think most importantly, really strikes the right tone in creating some innovative rate-making mechanisms to incentivize utilities who have been a bit reluctant because of their business model to invest in CCUS.
Kara, thank you. That was really helpful and comprehensive. I'll kind of ask you one follow-up question. I think certainly these, HB 200 is certainly unique in the United States. Are you seeing interest from other states kind of reaching out to you to kind of find out more and express kind of interest potentially in doing something similar?
Yes, and I would say I've had some conversations with North Dakota, for example, that may not, and I think other states are interested, that may or may not come to me at the commission. We don't consider ourselves policymakers. We are policy takers. And so I think most of those conversations are actually going on at the governor's office. And I know you had Randall Luthi yesterday. So he's probably hearing more about it than I am. I know other legislators are hearing about it. One thing I failed to say is the House Bill 200 rulemaking process was just started in September. And we follow a pretty informal process for a length of time, just like we did with the Senate File 159. We put out a call for comments, we set a date, and then we have a stakeholder meeting where we ask very specific questions that we want feedback on. We had our first stakeholder meeting for House Bill 200 on November 12th. The second call for comments will be issued on Friday, with a second stakeholder meeting scheduled for January 26th. So the rulemaking process on House Bill 200 is just sort of kicking off, but will continue through the next year. And well, there isn't probably as much urgency because of the timing as we had with Senate File 159. I would expect the commission to work hard on that issue through 2021 and try to get a final set of rules. The concept there is by the time we trigger the formal rulemaking process under APA, we have reached general consensus among the stakeholders. And so the formal process actually goes much smoother.
Great, thank you. And that kind of moves us into this conversation, kind of broader conversation on financing CCS. And I think, the examples we talked about from Wyoming were kind of a great example on these strategies of how do we advance deployment, given potentially the lack of the robust business case. And throughout these days, I think we've been talking about the fact that 45Q, depending on the type of project, may not be enough to kind of fully fund a CCS project. But some of this innovation, and we will talk a little bit later about kind of other policies that we're looking at, can help fill that out. But now I'd like to go on to Will, who's kind of sitting as part of the OGCI team, and they're funding certainly projects and also technology, and ask him kind of a general question on kind of the financing landscape for CCUS, whether or not with this COVID pressure we're seeing it diminish, or is, does interest seem to be kind of growing from the financial community in terms of helping these projects move forward?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. I hope I'm coming through. I'm just on my computer speaker, okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would actually say, I don't think we've seen, a major impact with COVID in terms of, impacting CCUS interest. I would actually say the opposite. I think, and I've been with OGCI for a few months now, but I would say the interest is actually growing in CCUS. I think from a financing perspective, I do think we're in the early stages of tax equity and really having, let's say, the sophistication for CCUS in the financing community versus wind and solar. So I think we're still kind of in a learning phase there in terms of how to monetize those tax credits and having the banks, show interest in terms of writing the big checks upon a final investment decision. But from, I would say from a developer's perspective, because CI, we're engaged with a number of developers in terms of projects in either like pre-feed or feed, some sort of developmental phase. I would say the interest in CCUS is actually growing, outside of political issues. And, our goal has really been to how can we de-risk some of these projects at an early stage and really get more specific projects moving forward. And that's been, one of the themes in the investments we've made into projects here and in the UK. But we do see at times there's a lack of capital, at the developmental phase, and that's a riskier phase of the project, although the amount of capital needed is much less versus when you go to FID. So I think developer interest is actually growing, which is a great part of this industry. I think 45Q, there's been a lot of really good talk on that, and I think people are optimistic about changes coming forth. I will say from my background, when you look at the full value chain of capture, transport, storage, the economics, I think you need to find, let's say, the low-hanging fruit if you're just going to be looking at 45Q as a means to fund a project. In most scenarios, I think that there's going to be need for an additional revenue source, and whether it's a reduction in carbon intensity of the product that you're making, which can be at times monetized through LCFS or other means, but there needs to be at times a revenue source with these projects in addition to the 45Q tax credit. But with that said, you know, there is low-hanging fruit available. We think at CI, some of these, what we call these high concentration CO2 streams, which tend to have a lower cost of capture, you know, significantly lower associated with that. So we think areas like ethanol, ammonia, and natural gas processing really can be first movers in this sector because of that reduced cost of capture. But then you additionally have, you know, transport and storage, and those are, you know, significant costs and really point a little bit more towards, you know, wider hub infrastructure. So, you know, overall, I think we're very optimistic, even where we were, you know, with 45Q in the state today, and we're very optimistic going forward in terms of seeing interest from developers and strategics in the space.
Great. And, you know, I'll bring kind of Lee back into this conversation as well in terms of, you know, what type of policies, you know, are people kind of currently looking at within the United States in order to enhance this value proposition? And I know there's several around 45Q, such as direct pay, as well as, you know, when we talk about this infrastructure question, sometimes some of these low-hanging fruit facilities like ethanol facilities aren't necessarily close to, you know, places to store that CO2. And certainly in relation to Colorado, you know, if we look at that northeastern section that has a lot of the ethanol plants, which are close to kind of Nebraska, Kansas, you know, that could be an area as well. So Lee, wanted to kind of hear your perspectives there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to complete the policy framework, and we also need to change our thinking about policy. Like 45Q was a good start, but now we really have to look at it as an evolution, because innovation is an evolution, and we need to adjust the policy framework every few years, as other good innovation policies in the energy space have done. And so for CATF, completing the policy framework means allowing for policies to drive down the cost, to shorten deployment timelines, to build out the ecosystem of storage and transport infrastructure. And of course, as we'll elaborate, and make these projects financeable. And the way we do this, of course, is optimizing 45Q. It is the most progressive CCF specific incentive. So we want to see direct pay, and we want to see an extension of the commence construction deadline, and the impacts are pretty are expected to be pretty significant, with more than, we could be potentially capturing 150 million tons by 2035, in addition to what we have today, just in industry alone, with a 5-year extension of 45Q commenced construction. Beyond this, we of course need to make sure that we have additional demonstration grants available, and really make sure that we're not just building one of each, but multiple of each, multiple demonstration projects. We need to get away from this idea that we're just building a single demonstration plant and then we've demonstrated the technology. We need to make sure that we can have 1 through 5 and harvest the cost reductions, which we have seen, particular, for example, in coal power plants, can be up to 30% or even higher from first to second. So we need to harvest these large cost reductions and to get the technology to scale. And then the infrastructure is a key component for Clean Air Task Force. And we're really excited to see the introduction of the SCALE Act today in the House by Representative VC McKinley, Stauber, and Bustos. And the heart of the SCALE Act is really a policy to provide 0% financing plus grants tied to supersizing of CO2 pipelines. And it's also tackled to really building on the Carbon Safe program to build out large-scale CO2 storage sites. And so what we're really hoping to see with this bill is that we're investing in infrastructure as a key enabler, overcoming chicken and egg problems for the creation of a carbon management market where we have multiple sources of CO2 and multiple sinks. And when we're looking at the map today of the 30 projects that have been announced as a result of 45Q, most of them are very close to existing infrastructure or existing storage sites. So we're not, as long as we don't have this important infrastructure, transport and storage link, we won't ever get beyond these 30 or 40 next projects because we can't build this carbon management market. And I also just wanted to highlight the Net Zero America project study that was released yesterday, which included investment in facilitating policy incentives to build this carbon dioxide transportation network or trunk lines like we've seen in Alberta with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, for example, as a priority action item before 2030. And looking at the map, especially for this region, there's large infrastructure involved that's connecting the basins in this region with the basin down in Texas. So I think we really need to make sure that we're completing this policy framework and plan and understand the infrastructure that we need to scale up carbon capture today so we can optimize for costs and we can optimize for land use while really creating economic opportunity, regional economic opportunities and jobs.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to throw in one of the questions I'm starting to see from our chat box. And this asks, you know, are any of these technology applications standalone economic profit centers, or are they just a means of addressing some ESG concerns and legislated mandates? You know, the 45Q benefits alone don't seem enough to cover all the components of CCS. Maybe I'll ask Will to start there with the answer, and you can kind of bring maybe some of your, you know, technology hat back on. You know, when you worked for a technology company, how did you think about kind of revenue and opportunities? And now from your perspective, now how would you answer the question?
Yeah, I think from a technology developer, and we've had some really good talks today in terms of some of the great technologies that are out there. I do think focusing again on the low-hanging fruit could have advantages, and that's opportunities, right, where you have either high concentration CO2 or you've got, you know, like a brownfield infrastructure. You've got some sort of infrastructure you can leverage, particularly on the utilities side for the capture, because any incremental kind of utilities cost can really add to your total CapEx. And then the transport, obviously you're going to want to be near some transport infrastructure. The storage is a whole different animal, I feel like, where storage, you know, we're in the early stages of that. But I think, you know, if you can find a use of the CO2, right, there are uses of CO2 in areas like soda ash, the sodium bicarbonate. That's a commercial use of CO2. There, obviously, we've talked about EOR. So if there are kind of niche opportunities to find reuse cases where you can get some value for that CO2 as incremental to the 45Q, I think, you know, those again can be kind of first movers. I think longer term though, I mean, looking at carbon intensity and what is the value in terms of the economic production of what's coming out of these industrial facilities in terms of having a lower carbon product, you know, I think we're in the early stages of that. But if you look at products like methanol and, you know, other product slates, we're starting to see kind of segmentation, even in the energy market. You know, we may see movement in terms of gas-fired power integrated with CCUS, you know, maybe at some point receiving kind of renewable energy credits there. So I do think, you know, to the question that we're still kind of proving these technologies in terms of really the cost efficacy, because a lot of the, you know, the technical know-how is already there, but it's about getting the costs down. But the business cases, you know, to date have been, I think, a bit more niche. And so finding where that reduction in carbon intensity can be valued by the, you know, the products coming out, I think is a critical kind of issue for now.
Great, that's really helpful. And, you know, I just wanted to highlight, you know, we've talked about kind of carbon intensity in the low carbon fuel standard. And this was mentioned in kind of some of our conversations yesterday. Well, that certainly trades at a lot higher, you know, and it's traded at kind of over $200 per ton, and that could be stacked with 45Q. You know, it seems like, oh, that should be a no-brainer then. There should be kind of plenty of extra money there. But certainly what we hear from project developers, and a lot of times we're really looking at these early adopters who are doing this, you know, once you get through all the time it's taking as these early adopters to permit, and you're looking at storage and you're looking at infrastructure, you know, that $200 does kind of get divvied up and does go quickly. So right now, I don't know that those early adopters for projects are kind of making a ton of money, even, you know, under LCFS, but we do appreciate their efforts because we certainly think that they're helping to move the next level of projects along. I'm going to ask kind of a broader question, and this is probably more towards Kara and Lee. You know, what are you seeing in terms of community acceptance for CCS, and certainly policymakers and environmental NGOs in the press become, you know, proxies for the community? You know, how are you seeing kind of community support for CCS changing over time?
I can go first. I will just say I've been at the commission 8 years, been pretty focused in my, outside of my regular duties, to focus on carbon capture. Both Governor Meade and Governor Gordon sort of have an all hands on deck approach to carbon capture for Wyoming. And so every agency that has any ability to touch that, I think, has been involved, and you have a lot of those speakers involved in this. And I think many of you know others, from technology to regulatory innovation to DE-FEOO, et cetera. I like to think of carbon capture as a really big table, and there are a lot of different seats at that table, very, you know, much more diverse than my typical world of utility regulation that include labor, NGOs, environmental groups, utilities, all of those kinds of things. And what I think is a really unique aspect of that table is no one really cares why you're sitting in the chair. And I have to tell you, coming from Wyoming and spending quite a bit of my time out speaking about the coal fleet and our coal production, given that Wyoming is the leading producer of coal in the country, I'm not always received really positively. It's not unusual for people to get up and leave the room when I'm at a conference and want to talk about coal. It's a tough conversation to have these days. And so I really am appreciative of everyone in the carbon capture community. I don't think they care why you're at the table. They just want to help expand the technology options and get projects going. And they see everyone sort of as equal. You know, there are exceptions, but generally I would say it's been just a really positive experience to be involved with the carbon capture table, and really sort of just focused on being productive and making progress. And I would say from my perspective that the momentum has never been higher since I've been involved in these issues regarding carbon capture. I think 45Q, as Lee said, was an important driver of those conversations. But I think from my perspective, in terms of reliability for electricity, I think there is a recognition that it is going to be difficult and or expensive to maintain current reliability standards with 100% intermittent resources. And so, again, to Governor Gordon's credit, he's found a way to preserve those reliability benefits while pursuing clean energy goals.
Yeah, and I'm happy to build on this. I mean, I agree with what Kara has said, and I think it's also really important that we take into account the question of cost here. Is we need to decarbonize at least cost, and I think carbon capture is, as many studies have shown, is key to this. From a stakeholder perspective, I think the beauty about carbon capture that it has diversity of support, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to be building that diversity. As I said in my opening remarks, we need to create the supportive political economy. And so from a community perspective, there are really, obviously there's the policy community where there's competing priorities, especially when it comes to enhanced oil recovery. So CATF is really looking to investment in transport and storage to expand the market for saline geologic storage as a way to bring those actors that are skeptical of EOR to bring along, because of course saline geologic storage will be the bulk of the carbon storage market in the future. I mean, I think moving forward on the federal policy level, I think we have bipartisan support, which is really fantastic. The topic was really elevated by President-elect Joe Biden, who mentioned it in his town hall conversation. So I think the prospect is very positive. And then for me, there's another community aspect, which I think has received a lot of attention, rightfully so, and that is, of course, communities on the ground that will be in vicinity of these projects. And I think as we're creating the path for the U.S. towards net zero emissions, we need to make sure that we're creating policies that are delivering environmental justice and economic justice to these communities. So we need to make sure that we're taking into account the individual circumstances, that we're involving communities in these projects, but also need to make sure that we're keeping productive industries alive, as Kara is saying, that we're investing in communities, creating jobs, all of which carbon capture can do, because of course we're essentially building a climate economy. So I'm really grateful, Patricia, that you've asked this question, because I think this is really important moving forward as we're hoping to create more support for carbon capture and creating the supportive policy framework that I talked about earlier.
Thanks. You know, another question is certainly, and it kind of, this goes out to all of you, you know, we've talked a lot about whether or not there's the right kind of financial support for these projects going forward. And I talked about ESG this morning and, you know, how that potentially supports CCS. So how do corporate commitments to net zero matter? How do state commitments to net zero matter? We had yesterday, Dr. Will Torr and Randall Luthi demonstrate their state commitments. I mean, maybe I'll start with you, Will. Do you think those things matter to the financial community, and do they help drive investment? And what else can we do potentially to get the financial community more involved in supporting CCS?
Yeah, so definitely I think state and corporate commitments are critical at this stage of the industry, because I think we're still in an emerging phase, right? And you know, we're trying to find specific investment cases, very specific projects to invest in, and you know, state level incentives or kind of I would say state regulatory environments that are perceived as lower risk can really be critical to getting projects moving forward. Obviously, Wyoming has like a really long history in terms of CO2 capture to EOR, and is kind of ahead of the curve in terms of primacy and pore rights and all that. And so that is a very favorable, because when you look at a project in a developmental phase, right, there's all these unknowns. And a lot of times, a lot of them are around the subsurface, right? That's can be a critical path item. So I definitely think that's critical. And then the, you know, I think the corporate commitments, because, you know, being in an emerging phase in the industry, I think we're always thinking like, what's next? Like what's over the next 3 to 5 years? And those corporate commitments are really setting, I think, that curve. And so we're looking out, you know, we want to get investments going today because we could end up waiting forever. But without the corporate commitment on the back end and seeing, you know, general corporate commitment to lower carbon intensity products and also reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, I think is really critical, because, you know, the business cases like we've talked about, you know, maybe today it's hard to find 100 projects that have double-digit IRRs. I do think there are a subset of projects that still have decent returns. But so we are looking for, you know, additional incentives or funding from projects, and having a strategic partner, you know, someone who's going to fund the CapEx, right? The CapEx of these facilities is where the big dollars come in. And having that identified, you know, in the developmental phase, I think is critical. So from a bank's perspective, right, they're going to want to see a strategic partner, they're going to want to see the business case. And I think, you know, for developers, you know, getting that to the point where a project can take on debt, right, this is kind of a new thing. And so without that strategic commitment and state level commitment, there's just a lot more uncertainty and economic questions that need to be answered. So I think it's a great question. And I think Wyoming has really been ahead of the curve in terms of this space.
Does anyone else want to give thoughts on that?
I'll jump in just real quickly on the corporate commitment part. Obviously, from my perspective, that includes utilities, or I focus on the utility component of that. One aspect of House Bill 200 that I did not mention is it requires, as a matter of state law, that utilities include consideration of carbon capture projects in their IRPs. And in terms of meeting these corporate commitments from a utility perspective, it's important that carbon capture be considered in the IRP process. For all of you that are familiar with that, you know that if it's not in the IRP, it can't be part of the preferred portfolio and will not be part of the action plan. So we the governor put another incentive for utilities in House Bill 200 to include that analysis as an aspect of them meeting their corporate commitments. And then as it comes to state commitments, one of the aspects of House Bill 202 that the governor recognized was that Wyoming can do a lot. We export 2/3 of the electricity we produce in our state. As I mentioned before, we are the largest producer of coal in the country, 40%. And we believe if carbon capture can happen in Wyoming, it has two benefits. One, we can help our neighboring states, our friends in other states, meet their clean energy goal by providing them reliable, low carbon electricity that fits within their clean energy policy. And then to the states where Wyoming exports its coal to, which I think at last count is about 30, demonstrating CCUS successfully in Wyoming allows those power plants in other states that burn Wyoming Powder River Basin coal to use those technologies as well to help them maybe take a step forward on those technologies. So I think, again, House Bill 200 supports both of those kinds of commitments.
And I'm going to ask kind of one more question here. We're running out of time, and look for Lee, but happy to have others. And Lee, if you had any kind of points you want to fill in there for this question, but let me get this one out. You know, how do you get potential sequestration investors comfortable with the exposure implied, unclear liabilities, recapture, concentration risk with a Class 6 well? I know you've done some thinking there, and maybe you can just highlight from an NGO perspective, you know, how do you feel about kind of states assuming liability? And there's a lot of different liability models, and just kind of give some perspectives there.
Sorry, unfortunately, my Zoom cut out, so you were stuck. I don't know if you can hear me. It says my internet connection is unstable. Okay, so if you could repeat it, I heard liability.
Yes. So the question was, how do you get potential sequestration investors comfortable with the exposure implied? So unclear liability, recapture, concentration risk, but maybe kind of speak to different state liability models briefly. And from an environmental NGO perspective, how do you look at, you know, this equitable distribution between kind of states and private sectors on liability?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I mean, there's many different models of how to handle liability in different countries. And I think, you know, obviously California under the low carbon fuel standard has a more stringent liability than other places. And I want to actually refer to a report that the Institute's Ian Havercroft wrote on liability, which I'm sure Patricia can share, where he interviewed stakeholders exactly about this question. And what he found is that the concept of liability is actually very well understood. And it's often seen as an obstacle, but for those that are really implementing these projects, it's very well understood and not a key barrier to carbon capture projects. So I think that's a very important piece of information that the Institute put out there. That being said, I think, you know, transferring liability after a certain time frame to the government, I think this is the case for Wyoming, if I understand correctly. It's certainly so in Australia as well. I think are ways to mitigate the exposure and the risk. And what we're really trying to do here is, of course, we don't want to jeopardize any of the transparency that I talked about earlier, but it's really just making these projects investable, reducing the risk to allow for investment in these projects, because to make this a real solution, we have to get steel in the ground. So we have to minimize risk and address risk through policy. And so I think this would be my take on this. I'm sure Kara has much better answer on Wyoming specifically, and Will can talk more about risk, but this is from our perspective.
Kara, do you want to give a thought quickly? And then I think we're running out of time here. I'll kind of introduce the breakout sessions after your comment.
Yeah, I will be brief actually, because this is actually outside of the jurisdiction of the commission. So I don't have any official comment on that at all. I would just note that another way that Wyoming has led in carbon capture is the statutory framework that our legislature put in place in 2012, I think, which addresses many of these issues. But again, given it's outside of our expertise, I probably shouldn't comment on that.
Okay, well, I'm going to thank all of Lee, Kara, Will, I think this was a really great conversation to end the day, and I certainly appreciate all of your interactions and your support for CCS outside of this kind of event as well. I think you're all kind of real leaders in this space, and looking forward to continuing to work with you all. As I said, we are going to go into breakout sessions, and you should have gotten an email that kind of highlights how to get into those. I'll share again what the 3 kind of breakout sessions are. And Ben, if you can put in the chat session a link to that Zoom meeting one more time, so that people, if they don't have any access to that email, they can click onto the upcoming Zoom session from the chat. So we will have a breakout session again with Keith Tracy. Keith obviously talked about 45Q, and he'll be able to answer questions there. Breakout session number 2 will be with Emily from Sargent and Lundy, Emily Kunkel, and she will talk about how they work with companies to potentially look at different technologies for projects, access to water and power, things we've talked about as important issues, and generally how to kind of think about CCS at your organization. And then the breakout session number 3 will be more about understanding the Wyoming context regarding technology support liability, and we'll have both Jason and Kara will be in that session. From my perspective, thank you so much for joining us these past 2 days. We greatly appreciate it. I know that we didn't get to answer all of your questions, but certainly you can bring those on to the breakout sessions I know there were a couple for Kara that people had still there, so you can bring that on to the breakout session. I would say that the CCS community is a very tight community. Please feel free to connect with me and any of the speakers on LinkedIn. We are only going to move this industry forward if we work together. And we need to move this industry forward. We need to scale up deployment, and partnering with everyone on this call is an important part of doing that. So we will take a 15-minute break between this session and the breakout session starting, but I encourage you to come on early. You should be able to choose your breakout sessions, but a lot of people haven't upgraded their Zoom, and so sometimes there's some time for us to get you into the right breakout session. So if you come on early, we can move you into the right breakout session as soon as possible. But again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to the U.S. Department of Energy and the United States Energy Association for supporting these events, and we look forward to talking to you in the breakout session. And just FYI, after the breakout sessions, the moderator will just close those sessions. We won't come back to this common session. But thank you, and look forward to seeing you in the breakout sessions.